While Donald Trump has secured his return to the White House, it will take more than 2 months before he is back in the Oval Office. His inauguration will be on the 20th of January, with incumbent Joe Biden remaining in power until then. In a decisive victory, Trump won 5 of 7 battleground states and is also ahead in Nevada and Arizona, which have yet to declare results. His rival, Kamala Harris, conceded defeat just before midnight South African time, promising a smooth transition. Let's unpack the story further, bring in international relations and security analyst Dr Faith Mabera. It's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. And shall we perhaps take one little step back? Did you find the results of the US elections surprising at all?
Good afternoon, Michelle, and good afternoon to the viewers. From my own perspective, I was actually not that surprised. What surprised me is actually the nature of the landslide victory. I mean, a lot of the projections were giving razor-thin margins, but I think I was actually surprised by just how big the gap in fact, if you look at the latest figure, I thought it would maybe capitalize mostly at around maybe 280. It's gone close to the 300 mark in terms of the votes from the Electoral College. So that's a definite landslide victory. It's a very sort of vociferous voice from the US electorate. And it speaks to the scale of the mandate that the Republicans and Trump at the helm of the Republican Party has been given in these elections.
And, you know, I wonder whether the Democratic Party is trying to look internally to what went wrong in their campaigning and their strategy for these elections. A lot of things working against Kamala Harris, the fact that she had just over 100 days worth of campaigning. Arguably, Donald Trump has been campaigning for the past 4 years.
Yes, and the nature of the violent rhetoric that's now coming up, the kind of blame games that are being passed around at the moment is actually very interesting to see. And I think it all takes us back to the moment when Kamala Harris, for all intents and purposes, was handed over the candidacy by virtue of the kind of inability and lack of capacity that Biden was facing, especially the pivotal moment being the debate in June, where Biden's abilities perhaps were thrown into sharp focus. And then we saw almost an agreement by the top echelons of the Democratic Party to say that, no, we'd rather hand over the baton to the candidate now as Kamala Harris. And this, of course, then presents a very interesting picture as to the nature of her as a candidate, of course, going back to the history of when she herself was running as president in 2019, and the kind of policies, whether the distancing was there between what she represented as candidate Harris versus what she was supporting as VP under the Biden-Harris administration. I think those were very interesting points to consider in really shaping up how the wider public also perceived her as a candidate. It speaks to her, the degree of her popularity across the electorate, but it also speaks to interesting points I've seen about the repudiation by the electorate on a number of what they felt was unfair or unacceptable policies by the left, by the establishment. And I think the outcome of this election is certainly that kind of repudiation.
We saw, obviously, lots of congratulatory messages from world leaders, including our very own President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday, to Donald Trump. There's going to be an impact, most certainly, on geopolitics, right? We will talk about the impact on Africa and South Africa, perhaps AGOA as well. But I want to talk about the message from China yesterday. Very much a statement that is on the fence. It says China's hopeful for a mutually respectful and peaceful coexistence, sort of quite a pragmatic approach to what the next 4 years might bring.
Yes, and that speaks almost to a recollection of what the first Trump administration represented. This speaks also to his leadership style. So Trump has come across as a very mercurial personality. He's also increasingly in favor of a transactional style of politics. And this has implications for the way that perhaps we see the US foreign policy being conducted, not only vis-a-vis peers or vis-a-vis strategic rivals, but also with respect to its engagement in the multilateral sphere. So these are interesting questions, for instance, as the kind of earthquake that maybe his presidency will present for transatlantic relations, for instance, with Europe, and the now interesting dynamic or juncture at which the Russia-Ukraine war finds itself in. There's a lot of questions being raised about what will happen with regards to the US support of the Ukrainian war effort, whether there would also be a fundamental shift in policy and perhaps a significant drawback by the US in that regard. That's something that's up for discussion. With regard to China, I think it's the bigger question here is the kind of rhetoric we've seen from Trump regarding particularly tariff hikes, his preponderance to use tariffs and weaponize tariffs, especially in the geopolitical trade-off and trade wars with China. But this is also at an interesting time because it also has secondary and downstream effects for other US allies, such as Europe, for instance. In fact, as we speak, we are seeing what could potentially be the dismantling of the German coalitional government by virtue, for instance, of the kind of recession and the kind of economic woes that very behemoth economy in Europe is facing at the moment. So these are some of the ripple effects that we see. But I think also it's important to situate Trump's victory in the context of larger trends that we're beginning to see. I already talked about that rejection of globalist politics, establishment politics, but it's also cohering with a trend across the globe of a swing, this potential wave of populist politics and right-wing parties really taking center stage, them being seen as the more preferred option by an increasing majority of electorates across the world, not only in Europe, but now also coming very much in sharp relief in the US context.
Dr. Mabera, I'm glad you talked about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is a Trump presidency good for global peace, for world peace? And of course, we're talking about as well, specifically, a ceasefire in Palestine. Humanitarian aid groups continue to call for a ceasefire insofar as the Israel-Gaza war is concerned. How does a Trump presidency, if it does, complicate that?
It speaks to the unpredictable and mercurial nature, as I mentioned, of his leadership style. But there's a few glimpses we've been offered into, for instance, when you see the dissatisfaction, especially by his constituency as to the large amounts and sums of monies being funneled from US to Ukraine, that perhaps will become a focal point in really considerations as to where perhaps his policy regarding the Russia-Ukraine war would go. So on one hand, we might see him favoring back-channel communications with Putin, for instance, and the negotiations in really bringing that kind of agreement to the kind of violence to an end, especially because we've seen how he's preferred this kind of very person-to-person engagement with a lot of the world leaders rather than completely disregarding room or scope for engagement. So I think for me, in that regard, we're likely to see much more consideration on his part for talks with President Putin, and also in that regard, maybe offering an off-ramp with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war. The Israel factor is a bit more complicated, I would say, but by and by, I think the big implication here is a slight reconfiguration of U.S. elections in the U.S. policy in the Middle East, in this regard that Trump not essentially being a war president, not largely in favor of just committing blood and troops in a lot of fights or war theaters abroad. So that would perhaps be a consideration with regard to the Middle East politics and particularly the Israel-Gaza conflict, which is currently at play. So it would be a question of whether he would be able to restrain Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu in this regard and really curtail the funneling of more diplomatic and military material and resources to Israel's own war effort.
Dr. Faith Mabera, international relations and security expert, thanks very much for your time. We're talking all things US elections and how another Trump presidency may well reshape the world. Another issue as well is climate change, of course. We know that in his previous administration, Trump, in fact, pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which commits all signatories to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What might be the impact of a Trump presidency on a whole range of things, but including climate change issues?